I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today is the beginning of our...
An epic. I feel like we should have some kind of theme music, like
Dun,
from
dun,
Ben-Hur,
dun.
like some historical...
Wagner, we come in just like an Apocalypse
I like that.
Now.
Dun, 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 dun. I think the theme song should just be us humming The Ride of the Valkyries. Dun, 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 dun. Be like one of those 20th Century Fox things, where Ralphie from The Simpsons is humming along. That could be that. It could be our version of that.
Fair enough.
So we're looking at, Lee, what's the series?
So the series is, each decade, we're going to take a look at the best writer in Chinese literature.
Most influential work.
And Rob, you and I don't always agree.
You and I frequently don't agree.
So each decade, we're probably going to have
We're going to disagree.
This
is going to be a different one, because usually we only talk about one thing at a time, and we typically just sort of agree. We might have different opinions about that thing, but we agree about that thing. We're going to talk about that thing.
I don't think that's true.
Well, this is Lee just messing with me. But in this one, we both know what the other person's pick is going to be, and we've already disagreed about pretty much every choice so far. But the idea here is there's already podcasts, there's already books about Chinese history. Like, what's the history of the 20th century?
And if we could say the Chinese History Podcast, I think, is one of the podcasts that we draw off of for inspiration.
If you're looking for a solid podcast in this, in the China History Podcast,
Laszlo Montgomery's amazing.
Yeah. Anyway, we're taking a different look at that, decade by decade. What, in our opinion, is the work that when we think of that decade, this is the work we think of for various reasons. We'll have different reasons. We'll likely disagree. If you are coming at us on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or something, feel free to chime in and tell me why I'm correct and Lee is incorrect. I'll be happy to have your support. Well, that's enough of a lead in.
So this is the epic 10-part series. Each decade we're going to look at the most influential Chinese writer or writers in the 20th century.
Right.
So this is the 1900s decade, the very first decade of the 20th century.
Right, 1900 to 1909. So Lee, let's hear it. Who'd you go with?
I went with Wu Jianren.
Wu Jianren. Interesting. I say interesting as though I didn't know. You and I talked about this beforehand. I'm faking it. I already knew you were going to say that, and I don't agree. But how do you want to do this? Do you want me to tell you why you're wrong, or do you want to hear mine too, so you can tell me why I'm wrong?
Let me just briefly
make your case.
Yeah.
All right, let's hear it, Lee.
Wu Jianren to the listener. So Wu Jianren was born in southern China in Foshan, which is where a lot of Chinese American immigrants actually come from. It's in Guangdong. He was born in 1866, and he died in 1910 in Shanghai. So he didn't live all that long. He wrote several important works, the most important being what's normally translated into English as the Sea of Regret, but sometimes it's the Chinese name is called Henhai. And he also wrote Xin Shitou Ji, which is the new story of the stone. I think both of those are some of the most popular works from this decade, and that's why I picked Wu Jianren. Maybe I should explain his most popular work, Henhai, which is a work. It's interesting because I think he wrote it in like a month. And he was trying to prove why traditional arranged marriages are the right way to go for China. And I guess he's the ideal writer for those of us who are writers who don't use outlines, because eventually he completely undercut his point and abandoned it.
Nice.
By the time
which is not uncommon among late Qing scholars.
Right. So, I mean, you have a guy and a girl, they're in an arranged marriage, and then all of a sudden, the 1898 Boxer Rebellion breaks out, and in fleeing Beijing, the lover and beloved are separated as they're scurrying outside of Beijing, just at the same time that Empress Dowager Cixi was was fleeing from Beijing. And in that period, a lot of bad things happen, and we follow our hero and heroine. The hero tries really hard. He's a good Confucian guy, and he eventually, through hard work and all of that, he becomes like he kind of like fulfills his destiny as a good guy. But the girl, it doesn't work out so well. We don't want to ruin it for you, but he eventually, the hero catches up with the heroine, and the meeting is not what it's supposed to be.
Right. And fun fact here, there's no way we still have a record of this, but if memory serves, that was like the second podcast we ever tried to record, or third. I think the very first one we did was Jianren, and then
Renmen Wenshui.
That's
Renmen de Wenshui.
And then this one, Lord, I don't even know where that is anymore. It's probably a good thing we don't have it. It's one of those early demos, and when you listen to it, you're like, wow, I didn't know that Led Zeppelin ever sounded like that. We're the Led Zeppelin of podcasts is kind of what I'm getting at. But
we are the Led Zeppelin of Chinese literature podcasts.
That's exactly what we are.
Come from the land of the ice and snow.
Talking about something that rhymes with snow. Joe. There's a lot of opportunity there with the name Joe. So you're doing Wu Jianren.
What's yours?
Before we start fighting, I am doing the late Qing scholar Wang Guowei. I know. Wang Guowei, kind of a similar time frame.
Hence, we're doing it by decades.
Right. So he was born in 1877, died in 1927. He's notable for a lot of things. One of them, he's one of the very few late Qing scholars who actually spoke more than one language. He studied Japanese. I don't know how well he read English or German, but I assume he read them well enough to read and comment on them. His 1902 essay, discussion of Dream of Red Chambers, Hongdou Meng Pinglun, is one of the very few works from the 1900 to 1909 period that you find in literature anthologies from Chinese literature. The vast majority of stuff from the late Qing, like 1890s to about 1918, no one reads. In fact, I'm going to get into this with Wu Jianren because interesting he may be, but good writer he is not. Wang Guowei is also one of the only. You can attack me in a second. I can see you glaring at me. We'll get into that in a second. But Wang Guowei is also one of the only scholars I'm aware of, full stop, before about the 1920s or 30s, who is well learned enough in European philosophy and science to actually write knowledgeably about it. And his trajectory is interesting because by about 1907, 1908, he has decided, you know what? I think I'm kind of done with this. I don't like this polarity in philosophy. You're either this or you're that. So I'm going to start doing just literature again. And my favorite work of his, Poetry Notes from the Human World, Renjian Sihua, is 1909. And it is an attempt to fuse what he still appreciates about German idealists and philosophy, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche specifically, with the best of Song Dynasty and Tang Dynasty poetry. It's fascinating. It's unlike anything else written in that era, and is, at a conservative estimate, at least 20 times more interesting than anything Wu Jianren ever wrote.
I guess, quick question, Rob. How many people have ever read Wang Guowei, and how many people have read Wu Jianren, the best-selling author of that decade?
But here we have to stretch it past that decade, Lee. If you look on all the possible articles on these people ever written, I can almost guarantee you're going to find way more on Wang Guowei than you are Wu Jianren. How many? Let's put it this way. If you go to some international app, Kindle, something else through Amazon, and you type in Wang Guowei, and then you type in Wu Jianren, there are about 10 or 12 different editions of Poetry Notes from the Human World. I'm willing to bet there aren't that many of anything what Wu Jianren wrote.
I don't know. I just think that, at least in this decade, everybody who is writing Chinese literature they're struggling for what Chinese literature means in this new 20th century. And by new, I mean not only was it the start of a century for everywhere in the world, but also it was really the beginning of when Chinese folks came to regard themselves as a part of this broader world. Before 1900, there had been a lot of resistance to thinking of themselves in this world. And I think that Wu Jianren is not that great of a writer.
At least we agree on that.
He is interesting because he articulates this sense that China and Chinese literature is struggling towards a new understanding of itself. And that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about Hunhai, the Sea of Regret, is even though Wu Jianren set out to prove that arranged marriages were the right way to go for China, he ended up writing a novel that came to the complete opposite point. And I think that sort of symbolizes the struggling of Chinese literature as a canon and Chinese people as a group to try and figure out what the heck is going on in this decade. Like they don't know what their destiny is. They don't know what their identity is. They don't know where they're going. They don't know even who they is when they talk about themselves.
They is. I like that.
They is. Rob, you and I are both Southerners, so we can say that.
I'm down with that.
You is down with that.
I is down with that. I'm sorry. You're right. Thank you for the correction. I see all those points, but the reason I go with Wang Guowei is because Wu Jianren is writing an interesting story. Wang Guowei is actively trying to incorporate all the stuff that has made Chinese poetry distinctive and interesting in a context where European philosophy is in dialogue with it, which is unheard of. It's almost unheard of since. When you talk about informing identity, that's one of the reasons I picked this. What does it mean to be Chinese? Well, frankly, Wu Jianren's work comes and goes. Wang Guowei's work in the 1900 to 1909 period is one of the only bodies of work where someone is actually trying to bring into dialogue, active dialogue, Chinese and non-Chinese things. And in a way that's not just like, you and I have read a lot of Liang Qichao, who translates a lot. Kang Youwei, he does some really weird stuff. Wang Guowei is the only one of that crowd who's read enough to be able to set them into intelligent dialogue. Those are the only works from that decade I see that are accomplished at actually putting this stuff at the table together.
I agree with you that Wang Guowei is someone who you can still read and go, wow, I can find value in that as a Westerner from the early 21st century. That said, I disagree with your assessment that all other people were not. Like Wang Guowei was the only one who was thinking about things, these discourses coming in from the West. So Wu Jianren...
Can I make a correction? Okay.
Wu Jianren, he wrote Xin Shi Tou Ji, that is the new story of the stone. And the story of the stone, of course, is the Hong Lemang, the Dream of the Red Chamber. It has several different names. This is the classic Chinese novel, which we still haven't done a podcast on. We're sorry about that.
We'll get to that at some point. It's so freaking long and important. It's hard to even know how to approach it.
It's such an unbearable burden.
And you and I are so dumb that,
That's
it's
true.
just...
But he writes the new story of the stone. And what's fascinating is it's nothing like the story of the stone. It's nothing like...
No, it's totally different.
Cao Shuiqin's original work. And it's imbued with ideas of nationalism. So Wu Jianren writes the new story of the stone, and Bao Yu, the hero of the original novel, wakes up from a weird dream, and he's hanging out outside of Shanghai. He takes a steamboat into Shanghai. He kind of goes why are there all these Western barbarians who are captaining steamboats on the Yangtze River? And someone's like, oh, well, insurance companies don't allow anybody but Westerners to captain steamboats. And he makes this nationalist claim. He's like, why is that okay? Shaking his fist angrily. And then he goes through Shanghai and like looks at how modernity and Westerners have destroyed it, and then he kind of like flees to this imaginary Chinese universe called the realm of civilization. So Wu Jianren, in creating this book, the new story of the stone, he is actually, I think, combining Western notions of nationalism that are circulating through this period with this traditional Chinese literature.
First of all, just a quick correction. My point wasn't that Wang Guowei is the only one thinking about this. My point was that Wang Guowei is the only one who has read widely enough in the scholastic traditions of the West to actually know what he's talking about. So this is not. I'm not making a point that he's the only one thinking about it, looking at it. But no matter how interesting,
everybody in this period is looking.
You can't not, right? If you're reading anything. But like Liang Qichao, who translates a ton, arguably just sort of brings in Western works. Here's Jules Verne. Read it. Hooray, right? You have other scholars who are critiquing the West, but almost none of them have actually studied it. They've maybe read clips, right? They're going based on, as I would argue Wu Jianren is, possibly headlines from the newspaper, popular presentations of it. I'm going to go out, I don't think it's much of a limb, and say that Wu Jianren probably never read much in the way of European and American philosophy. And if he did, he probably didn't know much about it, just based on the novels themselves. They are interesting little picaresque journeys. New Story of the Stone is completely bananas. I mean,
it's incredible.
You should read it just so you can have the experience of turning a page and going, what is he doing? It's almost like picking up one. Remember those choose your own adventure books? Remember, Lee? You read those when you were growing up, right?
Of course.
Okay. I got hold of one once. This is before I knew what they were. I got it and didn't know how it worked. And I just read it like from cover to cover. And I was like, this is the weirdest story. This is, what is even happening? That's kind of the experience I have when you read New Story of the Stone. You're like, did he mean to put this here?
Bao Yu is like this incredible, like, so the original Bao Yu in the original Story of the Stone is, he couldn't care less about the outside world. He's about a couple of things. He's focused on gardens and having sex. And I would argue that, at least in the Chinese canon, picking flowers in a garden is not all that different from picking flowers in a garden, if you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. You're very subtle. Thank you for that.
But, you know, he didn't care anything about politics. He rejected politics.
Sure.
Jia Bao Yu, the original Jia Bao Yu. This Jia Bao Yu in the New Story of the Stone is all about politics. And so it's this very discombobulating thing. If you've ever read The Dream of the Red Chamber, the original Story of the Stone, and then you go, what is going on here?
Right. I think maybe that would, sorry, I just cut you off. Go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was about to say, I think that would be my point, though, is that a lot of these adaptations, either you're sort of made to choose, right? You either have a Jia Bao Yu who's nothing at all like Jia Bao Yu, but is kind of cool because he's, you know, sailing on steamboats and stuff, or you have a Jia Bao Yu who's exactly like the old Jia Bao Yu and therefore doesn't fit, right? You either have part of the tradition that's completely hacked to bits into hamburger meat and made into something new, or you have the old thing, which is Peking duck. You either have Peking duck or hamburger meat, that kind of thing.
That's an incredibly
you have McDonald's, or you have, what's the fast food? There's a fast food version. There's a ton of fast food Peking ducks, but I can't.
Zheng Gongfu.
Okay, there you go. Oh, that's right. Yes, thank you.
That noodle place.
Yes, I actually went there, and it was the saltiest food I think I've ever eaten.
It's
in my
actually
life.
okay. I mean,
it's not bad, but it's
not bad.
super salty. Anyway,
it's a good noodle place if you're.
It is if you're stuck in a train station, you don't know what to eat.
And it's only in train stations.
It is. No, actually, I think I have seen it outside.
I've never seen it outside of a train station.
You know what it is? Like, it's like Chick-fil-A. When I was a kid, Chick-fil-A was only in the mall, and then it was outside the mall, and it was very disconcerting.
Have I told you?
You've told me all about your Chick-fil-A experience. That'll be for another podcast.
That's a different podcast.
But anyway, let me finish my thought though. Is that so? You have one of these two options.
Finished. That was not 2 or 3 thoughts right there.
That was like 10 thoughts, and I didn't bother to really curtail, make them into anything coherent. But no, my point with Wang Guowei is that this is someone who is taking the tradition, the Jia Bao Yu, and actually making it work with something that's not that. So it retains its character, just as the Western sources are retaining their characters. This is someone who is actually making them work together to do something new, because Poetry Notes from the Human World is unlike anything in the 1900-1909 period in any country. This is very different.
So my final point is just that Wang Guowei is so you made the point that he's well read enough in Western philosophy, and you don't think
and the Chinese classics
and you don't think Wu Jianren is. I would say that's a very elitist perspective.
Ooh.
And
i.e. like smart.
And I don't actually expect my Chinese writers to necessarily be thoroughly familiar with both the classical Chinese tradition and crazy Western philosophy, which honestly,
which Schopenhauer is crazy.
Schopenhauer,
no matter what you think of Schopenhauer, he is crazy.
He's crazy. And so I would say that's why you should choose Wu Jianren.
So, I get all that, and I was a little torn actually choosing someone from this period, but when I think of something that is very popular, I would argue that the influence dies off pretty quickly, because the works in this period, like we're going to probably maybe agree on Zhang Ailing later on, who is both incredibly popular and brilliant as a writer, right? Wu Jianren is popular, but definitely not brilliant. I mean, you can like New Story of the Stone, but holy moly, that's a tough sell. Anyway, Wang Guowei to me is also worth reading from this period, because for me, he typifies a very uniquely late Qing Chinese experience, which is, this is someone who really looked to Western learning for a lot of things for a long time, and then found himself going, I don't know where I am anymore. This does not make sense. This does not do what I want it to do, but neither does really the Chinese source either. So I guess the best is to try to kind of bring them together the best I can, or he never really recovered his equilibrium. For the rest of his career, he writes a little about oracle bones. He writes about Song drama. He kind of picks and chooses, right? And for me, this is a very interesting example, because the late Qing, whatever else it was a period of just detonation. Everything that came before it was just taken to pieces. And you either were a diehard and you said, well, I'm not moving on, or you moved on. And that was extremely difficult. And for him, it was very difficult. And you see it in the writing.
I would just point out that Wang Guowei is not really a work of literature, but I think of him more as literary criticism.
Depends what you read.
Sure. So Rob, if people want more of you and I, which is more of more and more.
Yes. Great pun, Lee.
Thank you.
Great.
I spent all morning writing it.
I can tell.
Where should they go if they want more and more?
Well, let's make it quick. Twitter, Chin Lit Pod, as in Chinese Literature Podcast, but abbreviated, Chin Lit Pod. Instagram at Chinese Lit Pod. The website is ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com, and we are now proud members of the Patreon family. Just look up Chinese Literature Podcast and make us rich.
Patreon, that's where you can send us money to buy us our beer.
And other things. I mean, we got into this for the money. That's the whole reason you and I chose the field we did.
I thought we got into it for the beer.
Well, they're closely related products, I feel. It's hard to have one without the other,
I think if things continue in 2021 as they were in 2020, beer will become one of the forms of currency that is usable.
And Patreon may start accepting that. So look us up in those platforms. Also send us an email if you want at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. We do sometimes feature on the podcast people who've written us.
Yeah.
And leave us reviews at your website or
iTunes,
whatever streaming service you use
to help us get the word out. We need all the help
out.
you can get.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good place to end it.
All right, man.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.